Howdy, folks.
In just 6 years, ACT leader David Seymour has transformed his party from a minor player to a political powerhouse with a growing base of voters who support his vision.
This country has voted for change, and a record number have voted for real change.
Fundamentally, love him or hate him, David Seymour is a great politician.
He's a conviction politician. You know, he believes very firmly in the things that he's doing.
In 2023, he led ACT to its best ever election result. But for one candidate, it was a turning point.
For me, it's about drawing back the curtain and letting the public see and leaving them to make the decision.
In the wake of ACT's contentious Treaty Principles Bill, Mata traces his political whakapapa, the influences that helped shape David Seymour during his time in Canada, and we explore what impact, if any, they've had on his policies today.
The task of a government today is not to indulge in continual breastfeeding about colonialism, but to invite people whose ancestors lacked these elements of civilization, to invite them into the tent.
We look at some of the ideas promoted by the Canadian think tanks David Seymour worked with before he entered Parliament.
Definitely the Frontier Centre has been the kind of key vocal opponent of climate science, of anthropogenic climate change.
It is very much focused on partnerships with industry and minimizing the scope of Indigenous rights that might stand in industry's way.
And we attempt to put our questions to Mr. Seymour.
I want to wish you all the best with your taxpayer-funded crackpot documentary. We've seen your questions, and I think you're a joke.
You say that you're the party of democracy. In the spirit of democracy, when am I meant to get a word in to do my job?
Excuse me. Hi folks, how you going?
Leo Foley has always been guided by a strong sense of justice. A lawyer by trade, he also has a keen interest in politics.
I don't consider myself a tribal supporter of politics. I look at the party or a government and whether or not they're listening to the people and delivering the interests of people.
How would you describe your politics now?
Well, I'm a liberal, if I'm being perfectly open. I supported, or I was drawn to the ACT Party because of the founding principles that Roger Douglas had put in place. And I say that because I believe in an open market. I believe in a free market because from that starting point, a government is able to draw its revenue and then apply those funds to meet its social goals.
How do you see the free market and Te Tiriti working together?
Well, I suppose some people would actually say, well, how could you be supportive of a free market? But my tūpuna signed hei whakaputanga, they also signed hei Te Tiriti Waitangi. And if you look at those early interactions with European settlers, they were engaging on a commercial basis. They were dealing with French, English, Canadians, North Americans. I wasn't conflicted by that at all.
So in December 2021, Leo joined the ACT Party and put his name forward to become a candidate, signing up to take part in its induction program, the School of Practical Politics.
The School of Practical Politics is a series of 7 workshops. They're conducted online, and the convener and the party assign or prescribe certain readings to each of the prospective candidates.
And at that time, 2022 we're talking, was co-governance a big issue back then? And are you a supporter of co-governance? Do you think it can work?
Well, I believe that co-governance is a watered-down version of Te Tiriti. I'm supportive of anything that actually helps Māori. But as far as the party was concerned, it soon became very clear that they weren't having a bar of that.
After each of these classes, you'd be given homework, as you said, reading. Some of it was from New Zealand political figures like Richard Prebble, John Banks, Winston Peters. Besides from the New Zealand political figures, who else's writings were recommended?
Well, the prescribed readings that were from overseas were from an author by the name of Professor Tom Flanagan.
Had you heard of him before?
No, not up until that point.
The videos and the readings of Tom Flanagan's that were shared were mostly to do with campaigning, how to win, that kind of thing. Was that all you were encouraged to read of his?
No, all prospective candidates were encouraged to do more in-depth readings from Professor Tom Flanagan.
So who is Professor Tom Flanagan? He's been an influential figure in Canadian politics and a key strategist behind former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Helping pave his rise to power in the Conservative Party's 2006 election success.
A strong, stable, national majority Conservative government.
We wanted to find out more about Professor Flanagan's relationship with David Seymour. So, Mata executive producer Eugene Bingham organised a Zoom meeting. Professor Flanagan told us the pair became acquainted when Mr. Seymour was working at the Canadian think tank, the Frontier Centre.
My clearest recollection of David would be maybe around 2007. I think I was doing a book tour for my book, Harper's Team, which was about how the Conservatives had managed to come to power after being out of power since 1993. The Frontier Centre hosted me for a couple of events. It was somewhere in Saskatchewan. And David drove me there. So we spent some time in the car talking. And I imagine we were probably had chats at various conservative-leaning conferences.
During his time at the Frontier Centre, David Seymour became an active media presence, writing policy analysis, making TV appearances, even presenting and producing a video series based on the free market classic, Economics in One Lesson.
With me today is David Seymour from the Frontier Centre for Public Policy.
Hi.
So David, what is inflation?
Well, inflation is what happens when a government increases the amount of money circulating, but the amount of goods and services that people can buy stays the same.
To me, he was one of many young, energetic conservative activists. At that time, we had succeeded in putting together what you might call a conservative ecosystem in Canada, something that historically had been lacking. Of course, the centerpiece was the Conservative Party of Canada. So there was the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. You probably have one of those in New Zealand as well. That's probably the largest political activist group on the right side of the spectrum in Canada. Several research centers, the Fraser Institute, C.D. Howe, Frontier Center. There was the Manning Center, some specialized ones, a gun owners organization, there was a pro-life organization. And I think that ecosystem has been quite important in helping conservative parties win.
Aside from building a conservative ecosystem, one of Professor Flanagan's key focus areas is Indigenous policy, authoring reports, opinion pieces, and books such as First Nations, Second Thoughts, even becoming a media fixture.
And then there's the usual leftist rent-a-crowd getting involved in here, which muddies the waters, all kinds of environmentalists and anti-globalization activists.
David Seymour's book, Birth of a Boom, on the Saskatchewan economy, cites Professor Tom Flanagan's writings on Indigenous policy. We asked him what lessons Mr. Seymour may have taken from his work.
There'd be a number. One is that people have to create prosperity for themselves. It can't be given. Government can get out of the way, but government, no matter how much engages in transfer payments, can't actually create sustaining prosperity. Another one is that there's a difference between civilized and non-civilized peoples, what used to be called savagery, although we wouldn't use that term today. So the civilized peoples are, in the long run, enormously more powerful than uncivilized people. And so the task of a government today is not to indulge in continual breastfeeding about colonialism, but to invite people whose ancestors lacked these elements of civilization, to invite them into the tent. And you can call that assimilation if you like. It has to happen.
I mean, it's a deeply racist perspective. It's ethnographic. It comes from a very specific time and place to assume that all peoples around the world should follow the path of quote unquote progress that Western Europeans did. I think, denies Indigenous people our humanity, and that's unacceptable.
Dr. Hayden King is an executive director at the Yellowhead Institute, an Indigenous-led research centre at Toronto Metropolitan University. He's observed how Professor Flanagan's ideas have influenced Indigenous policy.
I think his views have become more moderate as time has passed, but late 1990s, early 2000, Tom Flanagan referred to Indigenous people as being too incompetent to self-govern. Some pretty racist stuff, and nonetheless, his ideas really were, I think, a cornerstone for successive Canadian governments and their approaches to Indigenous issues. So I would say that even today, 20 years later, we're still dealing with some of the corrosive ideas that Flanagan promulgated.
How's he perceived today, Tom Flanagan?
I think perceived differently in different quarters. I think among conservatives, especially in the west of Canada, I think that Flanagan is still seen as a sort of giant intellect in all things policy, and certainly when it comes to Indigenous policy. Among Indigenous communities, I think he's universally loathed. And then I think among contemporary policymakers and Canadians, I think, I would like to think that he's considered irrelevant and outdated and not to be taken seriously.
We asked Professor Flanagan if he wished to respond to comments made about him in this story. He described the criticisms of his work as standard smears coming from woke leftists, and listed his achievements, including teaching for 55 years at the University of Calgary and being elected in 1996 to the Royal Society of Canada. In other words, he said, quote, "I have been deeply involved in mainstream Canadian politics." We also wanted to learn more about the Frontier Centre, where David Seymour worked from 2007 to 2011. Do you know much about this organisation?
Well, it's one of the big think tanks in Canada that espouses this more rigid view of the collective relationship between Canadians and Indigenous people. So it is very much focused on partnerships with industry and minimizing the scope of Indigenous rights that might stand in industry's way.
They are interested in Indigenous policy? Why do you think that is?
I think that they, like many of the areas they focus on, speak up and try to encourage governments to move away from a more fulsome approach to Indigenous self-determination, because it stands in the way of provincial or state power, but also the access that industry has to Indigenous lands and territories. So Indigenous people for the Frontier Centre are sort of an impediment to that type of growth, that type of economic activity.
What impacts do these campaigns or this messaging have on Indigenous Canadians?
For Indigenous people in Canada, there is not a tremendous amount of capacity to do the type of policy analysis that is required to engage with federal and state or provincial territorial governments. So the vacuum is filled by these think tanks that come in and present governments with policy proposals on how to move forward. And there's most definitely cases where Conservative senators or members of parliament have prevented bills from moving forward based on the quote unquote evidence or data from think tanks. And in contrast, legislation has been introduced that's based on ideas from these think tanks as well.
Back in Aotearoa, after completing the School of Practical Politics, Leo was selected to run in Northcote for the 2023 election. But his doubts about ACT were growing, so he sought advice from a local Māori leader.
I wanted his guidance on where and how I should proceed. A meeting was scheduled. I sat down with him and I pleaded my case. And I'm quite a proud person. So for me to actually go to this kaumātua and actually ask for his help was a big deal for me. And I was basically told that you've made your choice. In fact, the words were, you made your bed, you sleep in it. So I left that meeting hurt, but I left that meeting more determined to change how I was going to campaign in Northcote.
Campaigning in an electorate where 6% are Pasifika, and with his own Tongan whakapapa to represent, Leo knew he needed to be ready to answer tough questions on ACT's Pasifika policies, and he was.
A question was put to me last night by the Pasifika community, and I actually answered it as honestly as I could. The question was, will you cut the ministry for Pacific peoples? And I said, yes. Because I tell you what, I'll tell you that. I said, the reason why we would cut it is because the money that's going into that bureaucracy, that bureaucratic process, is just not getting down to ground roots. You've heard it actually sort of said across this side of the panel. It's not getting down to where it's needed. It's actually being gobbled up by bureaucrats in Wellington. That needs to stop.
But what Leo wasn't prepared for was this.
In my fantasy, we'd send a guy called Guy Fawkes in there and it'll be all over, but we'll probably have to have a more formal approach than that.
David Seymour's refusing to apologise for a comment about blowing up the Ministry for Pacific Peoples, saying he makes jokes like that all the time.
So during a candidate training session, Leo sought David Seymour's advice.
I asked him for his view on how I would approach the Pasifika community in Northcote, especially after his comments about Guy Fawkes. That wasn't taken very well by David. He basically told me that that has nothing to do with the party. It's more about your individual concern than the party's concern.
And how did that leave you feeling?
Well, again, it sort of left me isolated from the rest of the 11 other candidates that were in the room. Most of them were his caucus, his present caucus. When I actually asked David for a follow-up answer, again, I was told that I'm not a team player and that I need to fall into line. And I basically said to David that it was a legitimate question. I'm not a politician. I said, you're the one who's been in politics. This is your third term. I said, I'm just after some insight from you. And his answer to me was, well, he got up and left the room.
Did you talk to any of the other MPs about it?
Well, I talked to Nicole McKee. I asked her if I needed to go back and actually clarify the matter with David. And she basically said, no, probably the best thing for you to do would be to apologise. And I said, apologise for what? I said, it was a legitimate question. And she said, well, apologise. He may have seen it as a challenge to his leadership. I said, I'm not even going to get in at the next round. Why would he see this as a challenge? So she actually said, if you want my opinion, perhaps send them an email apologising for your statement and for your behaviour.
At this stage, what is this telling you about the party?
That it's authoritarian. That wasn't the behaviour of somebody who tries to protect freedom of speech.
Mata approached Mr Seymour for an interview about Leo's allegations and his political influences. We also asked for interviews with other ACT MPs, including mahi. Our requests were either unanswered or declined. Instead, we were provided with a brief statement. All politicians and their parties have their critics, but few face obsessive journalists who go out of their way to stoke conspiracy theories about them. People will see this story for what it is, and ACT certainly won't be engaging with it. It's not the first time Mr Seymour has deflected questions by accusing Mata of engaging in conspiracy theories when asked about political connections. In early 2024, we asked David Seymour about Atlas Network, a global organisation of 580 libertarian and free market think tanks. Do the ACT Party have any links or connections to the Atlas Group?
No.
Have you spoken or taken advice from them or any group associated with them about the treaty? So, recently...
I can't believe you're doing this. I've read about this conspiracy theory and you're actually running it, but that's cool.
An Atlas Network spokesperson confirmed the Frontier Centre was an Atlas member at the time Mr Seymour was employed there. They also confirmed that in 2008, Mr Seymour completed an Atlas Network MBA for think tanks. The spokesperson said, "We emphatically maintain that our organisation is non-partisan, does not support or oppose candidates or parties, and has had no involvement in campaign or legislative activities in Australia or New Zealand." In principle, is there an issue with politicians working for or engaging with think tanks?
Well, I don't think it's, in and of itself particularly concerning. You could have people who come through different kinds of think tanks and into politics. I think that the concern that is raised when you're studying this is the sheer political capacity of these groups and also their resources.
Nicholas Graham from the University of British Columbia has researched the role of Canada's think tanks in shaping climate policy. How would you describe the Frontier Centre?
Yeah, I would say the Frontier Centre is a far-right organization. I think, even amongst conservative think tanks in Canada, it takes a rather extreme positions, I would say. It is the key or a key think tank promoting climate denial in the Canadian context. Climate denial hasn't been really prevalent in the Canadian context, especially in comparison to the United States, for example. But the Frontier Centre is a kind of key organization promoting climate denial, denying anthropogenic climate change.
David Seymour has floated the idea of pulling New Zealand out of the Paris Agreement for climate change. Should that be cause for concern?
We know that we need global cooperation on climate action, and Paris Agreement is one form in which countries can come together and try and work out collective solutions. Climate denial has really closely followed with opposition to various forms of climate action. So it's really often a pretext of saying, well, we really shouldn't do anything on climate change. So it's usually the first front against kind of climate action.
Do you accept that the ACT Party has contributed to climate change denial?
No. What we've done is we've contributed to climate change understanding.
Part of Mr Seymour's contribution before entering Parliament was to co-author a paper arguing there was significant room for scepticism about climate science and warning that if the man-made global warming hypothesis is wrong, then proposed economic sacrifices will be in vain.
So when Rodney Hyde, as party leader, said the entire climate change and global warming hypothesis is a hoax, how did he contribute to the understanding?
What year was that?
2008.
Okay, well, I was living in a separate country back then.
That country was Canada, where in 2007 Mr. Seymour's climate paper was published. Then in 2013, while editor of the libertarian C2C journal, an article was published that years later made headlines.
Canada's residential schools, a troubling relic of the past, but front and centre today in Alberta's legislature.
The Premier must address the profoundly racist views of his speechwriter, who called the residential schools experience of Indigenous people a, quote, bogus genocide story.
That speechwriter, Paul Bunner. The opposition wants him fired for an article he wrote in 2013. In it, Bunner defends residential schools, arguing that the concept of cultural genocide could create violent insurgencies, calling settlements with survivors perverse financial incentives, and doubting that trauma caused by residential schools is passed on, saying it defies human experience.
Seymour's accompanying editorial praises Bunner for, quote, taking on the thankless task of setting the record straight on the history of residential schools. The Frontier Centre shares similar views.
A think tank called the Frontier Center for Public Policy tries to get listeners to rethink residential school history by dispelling what it calls myths with what it considers to be facts.
We made multiple approaches to the Frontier Centre to discuss Mr. Seymour's time with their organisation, but never received a response. Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission estimates that more than 6,000 Indigenous children died while at residential schools. Many others experienced physical and sexual abuse.
There is residential school denialism in Canada, to be sure, but I think the voices of residential school survivors and Indigenous people generally have so far been able to sort of subsume that perspective. But the scale and scope of the violence of the Canadian Indian residential school system is incomparable, and to downplay that violence and the consequences and the legacy is repugnant, really.
David Seymour's time in Canada came to an end when he returned to Aotearoa, initially to work as a ministerial advisor to former ACT leader John Banks, and later to stand as a candidate.
Oh, no doubt that international think tanks have influenced most of our politicians, including David Seymour. I mean, one of the things that we teach in public policy and politics is there are many ways you can develop policy, but one is to borrow ideas from overseas. I think it's probably, like a successful marker of public policy overall to borrow ideas from overseas. Where that becomes a concern, of course, is the ideas that maybe don't fit so well with the local context or butt up against the constitutional context. And maybe that's been the case more recently.
Political scientist Dr. Lara Greaves says it's clear David Seymour's time overseas made an impression.
Of course, someone's past work experience is going to affect their time in Parliament, their time in Cabinet. I mean, that's why we always say, well, we want to have politicians from a range of occupations and like class backgrounds and educational backgrounds, because of course your past experience influences who you're arguing for, what you're arguing for, and your policy agenda fundamentally.
How would you describe David Seymour, the politician?
David Seymour is a great politician, that's the thing. Fundamentally, love him or hate him, he's very good at getting media uptake. He's really ultimately good at getting attention, connecting to his voters, and ultimately quite good at policy change, different policy manoeuvres. We saw the End of Life Choice Act. We're now seeing his work on the Regulatory Standards Bill. We're seeing him kind of, really move into those leadership roles. He's fundamentally a good politician.
And that's because during David Seymour's tenure, ACT has rebounded from a record low of 0.5% support in 2017 to securing 11 seats and a coalition deal that includes becoming Deputy Prime Minister. His relentless focus on policy, the key to ACT's success.
In 2014, he did actually quite literally reject the baubles of office, neglected not to be a minister in the national government so that he could carry on his private member's bill on assisted dying. And during 2017 to 2020, I think he learned that if it's an issue that you are championing as a smaller party, a one-man band at the time, David was a lot freer to promote that issue, and he found he could actually change a lot of people's minds. He got the referendum and it passed.
Now a director at public affairs firm Capital, Ben Thomas advised ACT's 2017 campaign and worked for former Treaty Minister Chris Finlayson. He says even though Mr Seymour knew the treaty principles bill would fail, it still benefited ACT.
It's been in the headlines for months now, and that is electorally productive. If you see ACT's polling now, it's up around anywhere between 8 and 10%, I think, in most polls. That's very high for a quote unquote minor party in an MMP government.
Is this just about political opportunity?
I don't think Seymour is being purely cynical. I don't think he's promoting something he doesn't believe. Again, you've got to look at when, where did the ground open up for this electoral opportunity? And during the period of the Labour government, there were these sort of kind of ideas that sort of took hold, the He Puapua report, and this discussion of co-governance that the Prime Minister sort of refused to define or really address. In my experience in working in the treaty space, whenever there is uncertainty, that's when you get anxiety in parts of the electorate, and that's when they're receptive to the treaty messaging. And so, you get that confluence of an electoral opportunity and something that broadly accords with his values.
But for Leo Foley, those values did not accord with his own. This became clear during a selection meeting where prospective candidates were interviewed by the ACT board and David Seymour.
And his question to me was, if you were in charge of the Maori portfolio, the treaty portfolio, how would you deal with robust discussions with iwi representatives or Māori, especially when we're actually campaigning on an anti-co-governance sort of basis? I asked him if he wanted a straight answer or a rehearsed answer, and he said, give me your honest answer. And I actually said, you cannot and you should not deal with Te Tiriti in that way. It's something that is it's a constitutional basis of this country. And I said that for the party to approach it in that light would cause chaos across all of Māoridom.
How did he respond?
Well, he looked up at me and his answer shocked me, to be honest, because he looked me square in the eye and he said it would be more than just chaos in the streets, Leo. And I asked him, I said, what do you mean by that? And he actually said it would cause a civil war. And that basically left me dumbfounded. I didn't quite know what to make of that.
We didn't know what to make of it either. It could suggest Mr Seymour understood just how divisive and potentially high stakes his approach to treaty matters could be. And even though we raised it with ACT, no explanation was given. Two sources confirmed to Mata that Leo had relayed Mr Seymour's alleged civil war comments to them in 2023. But it's such a serious allegation that we've come to Parliament to try one last time to get a response from Mr Seymour.
I wish you all the best with your taxpayer-funded crackpot documentary. We've seen your questions and I think you're a joke.
You say that you're the party of democracy. In the spirit of democracy, when am I meant to get a word in to do my job?
Excuse me. Hi folks, how you going?
Did you say to an ACT candidate that the reaction to your treaty policy would be like civil war?
No, I don't believe I've said that.
The work you did in Canada on Indigenous policy, are you using that as a roadmap here for ACT's treaty policies?
I didn't do any work on Indigenous policy.
Do you still share the views of Dr Tom Flanagan?
Look, I think he's a professor of politics who's written a lot of things. I think some of them are very right.
Which ones?
Well, he's a guy I haven't actually seen for over a decade.
His
so,
Indigenous policy?
Well, again, I'm not familiar with all his policies, so, you know.
Well, you quoted him in your book.
Well, you may well have done, but...
And the ex-School of Politics asked for people to read about him.
Well, he's written a book about how to campaign, which is what it was about.
How about Paul Bunner? He claims residential schools in Canada is a bogus genocide claim.
I don't know who that is.
Well, as the editor of C2C Journal, you platformed him and you quoted thankless task of setting the record straight. So, is the Canadian residential schools a bogus claim?
10 years ago when we published lots of
and
people.
And just a few years before you came into politics here.
Not everybody that edits something actually agrees with everything that people write on their banner.
But you did, you agreed with it. You said the thankless task of setting the record straight.
Yeah, well, in that case he was. But
in 2023,
anyway,
I asked you if you had any...
I tell you what, I'm here and happy to take any questions from people.
In 2023, I asked you if you had any connections to the Atlas Network, and you said no. So, do you?
The ACT Party does not.
No,
All
I
right,
said
folks,
I said you.
I'm here to take questions.
I'm
here to take questions from people about serious matters, not crackpot conspiracy documentaries.
What conspiracy am I a crackpot of?
Several.
You invited plenty of debate for the Treaty Principles Bill, but you refused to sit down with people and talk.
I'm happy to sit down with any rational person and talk. You're a conspiracy nutter.
While ACT declined all our interview requests, the party has consistently maintained its treaty policies are focused on equality and challenging ideas it sees as inconsistent with democracy.
Principles of the Treaty of Waitangi Bill, second reading. The Honourable David Seymour.
Everyone is equal before the law. Everyone is entitled without discrimination to A, the equal protection and equal benefit of the law, and B, the equal enjoyment of the same fundamental human rights.
In April, ACT's Treaty Principles Bill was voted down at second reading, 112 votes to 11.
We will continue to fight on for the truth that all Kiwis are equal. Ake, ake, ake. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
In reflection, what do you make of it now?
Well, I see Mr. Seymour as a politician who's considered his options and is looking at pushing this bill through the House, not to serve the people, but to divide the people.
Do you still have any hope for the ACT Party?
Well, for me, it's about drawing back the curtain and letting the public see and leaving them to make the decision. It's about informing the public about who's influencing New Zealand politics.